Hello everyone and welcome to episode 6 of our series on painting A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game miniatures. In this second season we're painting Bronn the Mercenary, Jaime Lannister as a prisoner, and Cersei Lannister. In this episode we're going to be going in and doing a little more detailed work, deepening the browns on Bronn in particular, and then working on the faces for our miniatures. Doing up faces is a step that I put into my workflow relatively recently, but I don't regret it, because faces are such a focal point of the miniature, they really do deserve a little more attention from you as you go forward. I'll discuss how I did it at the time that I painted these miniatures as we go on later, and mention a couple of changes that you could do if you wanted to get a little more detail in there. For now though, I'm going to mix a little bit of blue ink in with my brown ink, darkening the brown down without taking away any of its saturation the way that a straight black would. The blue gives it a little more richness and hopefully will make the shadowed areas a little better on the brown areas that I'm deepening here. I have to apologize in advance because throughout this episode there are some issues with focus. As I mentioned in previous episodes, I was trying to do all of these miniatures, like get them all painted in one big sort of 2 to 3 hour sitting on a Sunday morning. And so I was sort of talking and doing other things at the same time. And unfortunately that means that on occasion the camera work wasn't my first focus. So I apologize for that. Hopefully this is still useful to you, and it does go in and out of focus as we go on, and I do try and catch it and correct it whenever I can. However, you can see that in this case, all I'm doing is I'm applying a reasonably thick amount of this blue-brown mixture. Without taking too much off of my brush, I'm just giving it a little bit of a press to wring out any big globs of ink that may gather on the bristles. But other than that, I'm taking it as a loaded brush and just going straight over the brown areas. Here I'm looking over Jaime, and as I'm going along, a lot of this is improvisational. I just want to get the best look that I can for everything. So the one thing I notice is his bandages, where we put on a little bit of brownish blood. I wanted to brown it a little further and to drop him in my lap apparently, just to give it a little more sort of definition as we go forward. Adding more and more layers of color one over the top of the other was hopefully going to give it a little more depth, and it did sort of, especially once I thinned it out and spread it further, it did look like sort of soak into the bandages. Rather than just having a couple of cartoonish spots of blood in the center. Using the airbrush flow improver to help thin out ink that you're applying, as well as ink that's already on the miniature, can be really useful for trying to make things fade together. It's very similar to what some would refer to as wet blending, though that is an entirely different technique, and I'll discuss that in a later episode maybe. Or I recommend you look up a video by some of these more professional guys with better setups who can show you wet blending in more detail. For now, what we're going to do is we're going to take a little bit of our red ink, noting that it goes a little bit pink because it's a little thin when it applies, and we're going to be going in to do the mouths of our miniatures. Doing the mouths is sort of this first step towards making these faces look better, because just a little bit of pink on the lower lip, if you look at how the light and shadow falls on someone's face, I'm going to try and distract you away from me pitching all my stuff on the ground here, because I am a clumsy man. But if you look at the way the light and shadow falls on the face, especially if the mouth is slightly open, you are likely to see a little bit of pink inside the lip. I've experimented a little bit with making the pink be actually pink by adding some white to it, or just using some red, or using the magenta ink I have. Altogether, that's sort of a personal preference thing. It really depends on how noticeable you want it to be. This red stood out quite a bit, and I think the cherry red didn't look as good, obviously, for Jaime, even though it does thin out into a bit of a pink once it settles, but it did look very good on Cersei, in my opinion. Maybe using a little bit of extra thinner, or airbrush flow improver in this case, to just thin out the red and make it apply a little lighter over the brown might have made it look more natural in other cases. So I, like you probably are, am still experimenting forward and sort of figuring out what I want my technique to be, what I want everything to look like. Once I've decided I'm satisfied with how that is sitting, it's a very, very thin strip of red. Really, you don't want to overdo it. This is a tiny detail that's just going to be filling out the sort of contours and shape of the face when you look at it from a distance. But once I've done that, I clean off my palette again, because obviously, as you can see previously, it was getting a little bit crowded. And I'm going to go ahead with starting to apply eyes on the miniatures. The eyes are another part of the miniature that can be really intimidating because they're so small. And honestly, you could just leave them out and it doesn't take that much away from your miniature as long as the area the eyes are in is still shaded, so you get the impression of the shapes of the face. However, I've started putting the eyes on because I do find that it gives a nice extra focal point to the face, and while I'm not the best at it yet, I have figured out a few ways to do it that work out quite well. All in all, the sort of sum of the technique that I use for making my eyes is to make them resemble something like what you'd see in anime or manga. Sort of that wide black strip outlining where the eyelashes would be, with white in the center and a black pupil. So that outline of the eye in black ink is actually going to be what gives some definition to potentially the eyelashes, but more likely, because of the size of these miniatures, the eye socket, as it were. In this case, I put on a little bit too much white, and you do want to sort of clean that up as much as you can, because if you put on too much white, it blends in with the pink of the face, and all of a sudden you have no definition to the eye itself. Later on, when we put some black in, we'll be able to correct that as well by pulling in the darkness around the eye and cutting it off from the skin tone to make the eyes stand out as their own individual details. Here I'm trying to find a way to show you how I'm putting it in while also keeping it in frame and leaning close to my miniature, but I hope you can see I'm holding the miniature in various different ways, aided by the fact that I now have these little handles I've put together from corks, so that I can get the best possible approach angle from my paintbrush. Here, as you can't see, I'm doing the same thing. Again, I apologize for the camera work in this particular episode. There were some distractions going on. But I'll be trying to pay attention to that more as we go on later. I'm also trying to upgrade my setup, so look forward to future seasons where my setup for filming and painting is going to be probably quite different. That being said, here we go. We've got another example of using that handle to the full effect, so I can turn it over so my right hand can still approach that opposite side eye on Jaime, and get it with just the finest touch. Your best bet in these kinds of situations is normally to try and have the most natural position for your hand, because much like shooting a firearm, if you've ever done that, you want to keep all of the tension out of your muscles as best you can so that you don't get a muscle shake. When your muscles are tense for a prolonged period of time, they'll start to tremble very slightly, and especially when you're doing a small area like these eyes, you don't really want that tremble. So go in and just mark off the eyes as you can. Once you put in a very small drop of white paint in the eye sockets, we're going to go to our black ink. Now my black ink is actually a very strong black ink. It's excellent. I use it for calligraphy as well. And so even though I'm just using black ink and not black paint, it's not going to run very much, and it is going to have a very deep, distinct color to it. So we're going to go forward here, and we're going to be making basically the shape of eyebrows as well as the pupils for our characters. That'll bracket in the eye, give it some shape and definition, and then the pupil will obviously fill in what looks like an eye. The pupils themselves, as you put them in, try not to make them looking perfectly forward. A lot of these dynamic miniatures don't really look like they should be just staring forward in any case, and B, if you try to make them both perfectly centered in the eye sockets, that's much more difficult than setting them off to one side or the other. And of course, it's more difficult to get them aligned. If you don't get them aligned, you're going to end up with cross-eyed miniatures, which is probably not what you're looking for. As such, when I go about putting in my eyes, I always make them look off to one side or the other, like you can see me doing with Jaime here. I'm going to be putting my paintbrush right in alongside the bridge of the nose to put in this pupil, and the opposite pupil was just set at the far end of the eye socket as it was sculpted. By putting it in that way, I end up with, well, him just looking off to the direction that his head seems to indicate he's looking anyway. I also can use the guidelines of the sculpted detail to make sure that both of my eyes are alongside something that will just look like a good reference point when people are looking at the miniature later down the line. If you try to make them both centered, you have no reference points, and it's much more difficult to make them both centered on the same point. Especially considering that when we're looking straight forward, our eyes aren't really in the center of our sockets, but sort of the inner third, as it were. So if you put both eyes in the center, your character's going to be looking outwards like a chameleon, and it doesn't look great. So you can avoid that simply by just going ahead and putting in a little bit of a sideways look. Cersei here is a great example of that. Although her sculpting on her face did leave a little bit of something to be desired, most likely because there's not much detail to add. You can see at the beginning of this episode the primed example of her. There's really not much to see on that, and that is true when you're trying to paint as well. There's not much to refer yourself to in her sculpt. That being said, the line of her eyebrows does give us a really good reference for giving her sort of thick eyelashes, or at least that's what it looks like. Sort of emulating mascara or something like that. Obviously, I don't know if mascara in and of itself is appropriate to the Game of Thrones world, as it were, but the Egyptians had it, so obviously it was possible to produce at the very least and was used in some makeup. So it does give her a fairly well-defined and good-looking face. I'm pretty happy with it. The next thing I'm doing here is I've realized that I'm not super happy with how our base turned out, still. And so I'm going to be grabbing a little bit of white, mixing it in with our black, and trying to make a light gray that I was hoping might serve as a sort of grout and help me pick out a cobblestone texture from her base. This sort of experimentation, you know, like, as you can see, even though I'm trying to quote-unquote speed paint these miniatures, get them done in the morning, I'm still taking the time to mess around and do things differently than I had planned towards. So, you know, you can add or remove some time from my overall time for that if you just want to go ahead with a much better plan than I did. For me, though, experimenting and trying to get a particular look from the miniatures is part of the fun, which is kind of why my entire collection looks somewhat eclectic. I didn't restart painting all that long ago, after a fairly long hiatus, so I'm not entirely new, but also not super experienced, as it were. I'm still figuring out what my perfect workflow is, just like I'm sure you will be. Hopefully by watching these videos, you're getting some ideas of techniques you might want to use, techniques you don't want to use, etc., and stuff that you can compare to other videos on YouTube, of which there are a fairly significant amount nowadays. For my own part, though, a big, experimenting, pushing the limits of my current skill and trying to see what I can do, while also trying to just work in the way that's comfortable to me and quick and fits into my schedule, is sort of the name of the game. So, since I had a little bit of time, I'm mucking around quite a bit with her base. I had a concept, and I do think it's a good concept, and I wanted to pursue it and figure out how I wanted to start with it. I say start with it because I still, to this day, haven't really decided on a final design I want for the stone bases for non-combat units. So, I'm still working on it. We'll see what we come out with in the end, what gives the best sort of stony ground or castle-looking base. In this case, I've decided it is not this grouty cobblestone look, and so I've mixed a little bit of Airbrush Flow Improver in with my black ink, and I'm just going to start wiping away the details underneath. The Airbrush Flow Improver acts as a little bit of a thinner, and it's thinning both the black ink I'm applying and the layers of paint underneath, especially given that they are not super aged, they were only put on maybe half an hour before or something. So keep in mind that you can use Flow Improver like this to blend earlier layers together or blend them out, as I'm doing in this case, adding the black over top to darken them down and bring me back to a starting point where I can try a whole new different way of trying to do the cobblestones. As I do so, I'm trying to make sure not to brush too hard, because obviously when it has thinned the surface underneath, it has made it vulnerable to wiping away entirely. And you can see in front of her there's a small area where I slightly did that. It's lightened up because I wiped away a whole lot of the gray I'd applied previously. I'm going to get in and I'm just going to dab away with my brush to add some more dark to that and bring it more in line with all the other surfaces around it. I'm also trying to get in close to her dress so it doesn't look like she's got a halo of old colored stone around her that would stand out and make it look kind of weird. At this point, because the red ink on her dress has dried, I don't have to worry about capillary action like I did before, just sucking this black up into the creases, so I can get a little closer a little more safely. Although I am trying to make sure that I don't get any of the black on the hem of the dress per se, because obviously where with miniatures in the field like Jaime and Bronn over there, if a little bit of dirt gets on their boots, that kind of makes sense. They're walking through dirt. Walking along a stone floor in a castle is unlikely to have that kind of impact on you. So I'm avoiding getting any of that spillover. What I am going to do, though, as I keep in mind the fact that Airbrush Flow Improver can thin together different layers of paint, I'm going to get a little bit of that on my clean brush that I use for cleanup, and just spread it across her back where I had sort of done a little bit of a patchy shading previously with our layers of skin tone, building it up. These wide areas of skin, I just wanted to make sure that the blend was even better. So applying a little bit of this on top without, rubbing so hard that I rub it away, just dabbing it on the areas of transition can help smooth them a little bit as the flow improver works its way into the lower layers of ink and paint and thins them and forces them to blend and meet up a little better. Once I've decided I'm satisfied with them, I'm going to move on and texture their bases, at least the two bases that are out in the field. For that I'm going to be using this texture gel, which gives a little bit of a gravelly look to the ground, basically. And I'm going to be applying it with, a ratty old brush that's not going to be too damaged by applying these little plastic pellets everywhere. I'm reasonably generous with this and just try to get a random look to it just so it looks stony and bumpy on their bases. There's no particular design or logic to it. I'm just trying to get a spread across the entire base in a semi-random pattern just to make it look a little less even and flat, the way that the miniature's normal bases do. There's lots of different ways to do this to your bases, including, applying white glue and sand, or even super glue and baking soda. I recommend you look around on YouTube for basing materials or basing examples for miniatures to get some other ideas, and see which one you like the look of best. I'm still messing around and experimenting to see what I'm going to do for the rest of my miniature painting career. In this case, though, once we've applied that texture gel, we're done with our miniatures for today. So that was a pretty quick episode. I hope you enjoyed it and or you learned something. Throw down any comments or questions you have in the comments below. I'd be happy to see them. And as usual, I hope you come back for the next episode as we go forward towards finishing off this set of 3 miniatures. And until next time, go play some games.